That was John Blackstone reporting. John, thank you for that report. And with more on what comes next for Persky, Marisa Lagos covers California politics and government for the public broadcasting station KQED in San Francisco, and she's joining me now via Skype. Marisa, so this is a very nuanced discussion that I think people in California are having. I want to draw our viewers' attention to something that was written in the Mercury News. It says, it certainly appears the goal is to teach judges, all judges, some lessons. If you want to keep your job as a judge, keep an eye on media reports of public sentiment when you are exercising your sworn duty to sentence a defendant in light of the law and the facts. And they go on to argue that this perhaps is an undermining of the democratic process. On the other hand, there is a very serious situation of this young girl who felt that perhaps people were not listening to her, and this sends a very strong message to people who would seek to harm anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of have a collision of almost two sort of parallel arguments that aren't really, don't have much to do with each other. You know, this is really seen in some ways as a litmus test on the Me Too movement and how voters are reacting to women who are sexually assaulted. But I think there was also tones at the beginning of concern that this was also racially, you know, there was a racial component here, that if he had not been an affluent white college student, that maybe he would have faced a different sentence. And so I think, you know, to the point of this issue of judicial independence, it is a pretty stunning and decisive victory for folks who back this recall. But I know a lot of legal scholars and others, including Cordell, who was just in that story, who really feel like, you know, this, you shouldn't even be talking about this case specifically. You should be looking at the holistic question of how judges make their decisions. And I do think that this sort of plays into a larger conversation happening around judicial independence, but also we saw district attorneys in California being challenged from the left here. I think the electorate is getting more interested in what's happening in courtrooms, and this reflects that.
Right. In the victim statement, the victim wrote this: "You've dragged me through this hell with you, dipped me back into that night again and again. You knocked down both our towers. I collapsed at the same time you did. Your damage was concrete, stripped of titles, degrees, enrollment. My damage was internal, unseen. I carry it with me." So it certainly seems, to your point, that this is a litmus test for the way that many women throughout the course of the history of this country have suggested that they are not listened to, that they are not taken seriously. And when you had the sentencing from Judge Persky, it probably felt very much like that to this victim.
Right, and one thing we heard come up from these critics is that in his sentencing decision, Persky didn't mention the victim's impact statement, which, as you mentioned, was very powerful and very explicit. He talked about the potential impact on Turner, the offender. And so I think that when you kind of take those things, that it really did energize women especially. But again, you know, I think that we do have, you know, a set of sort of laws for a rule and guidelines for judges. We should note Persky was investigated. He was not found to have sort of violated any judicial misconduct rules. He did follow, you know, the letter of the law. And so really this is a question of whether voters are happy with that sentence, and clearly they were not. And
let me just ask you this, because I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know, but when you say that Judge Persky followed the letter of the law, that's his sworn duty, but could he go beyond that? In other words, could he say, well, yeah, this is what the law says I should sentence you to, but because of the serious, you know, the gravity of what this young man did to this victim, here's where I'm going to take the sentence?
Yeah, he absolutely, I think 14 years was ultimately what it could have gone up to. He was following the probation report. They recommended a year. He said 6 months. I mean, so I think that there probably could have been some middle ground there. You know, we haven't heard a lot from Persky other than the last few weeks as he was trying to defend that seat. But I think that that's what a lot of critics felt, that, you know, maybe you didn't have to go for the, you know, throw the book at him entirely, but that 6 months just felt like an insult to not only the victim, but to women in general.
All right, let me ask you about the political battle that's happening across the state. I mean, you know, we know that 118,000 voters turned up to the polls Tuesday in Los Angeles County, only to find their names weren't on the registered voter list. What exactly happened there, and how could it impact the results from yesterday's primary, Tuesday's primary?
Yeah, so what the registrar in LA is saying is that it was simply a printing error, that folks were left off of those and they were allowed to cast provisional ballots that will be counted. I think when you look at there's 5 million voters in Los Angeles, it doesn't seem like any, at least of the bigger contests like the governor's race, the Senate race, were impacted by this anomaly. But I think it really does stand to sort of undermine voter confidence in a system. We already are hearing so much about Russian interference in 2016, concerns about hacking of voting machines. And so this is not a good look, so to speak, for Los Angeles. I think it's something we're going to hear a lot about and really see some probes into in the coming weeks and months so that this doesn't happen again in November.
And what seems to be the driving issues for voters in this election cycle?
I would say housing and homelessness, affordability are really top of mind, especially in cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles. I mean, when you look at some of the congressional races and, things that have to do more with the federal government, we hear a lot of talk about immigration. But I think in California, we have such a high cost of living. There is a huge homeless problem right now. We've seen that play out in races, including the governor's race, the San Francisco mayor's race, which is still up in the air and probably will be for a couple more days. And so when we've gone out and talked to voters, those are really the things that they bring up first. And I think that's going to be a challenge. You have Gavin Newsom, the lieutenant governor, coming into first place against, and he will be facing a Republican in the fall. But people like him, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, are thought to have presidential aspirations. And I think the homeless issue is something that's really going to dog them in the coming years if indeed Newsom can win.
Marisa Lagos, thank you so much for taking time out with us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.